All right, thank you. So I'll be presenting about the giant mine remediation project and the frozen block method. So the first part of the presentation will give a brief background on the management of the arsenic at the site, the selection process that led to the frozen block method being chosen to manage the dust, and finally a bit about the freeze optimization study that's currently in process at the mine. So the giant mine is located about 3 kilometers north of town. It operated from 1948 to 1999 when the mine went into receivership. So reclamation of the site is now the responsibility of the federal government. And I guess the project is currently in the environmental assessment stage. So the arsenic that's stored at site comes from the rock. It was originally part of the rock, just like the gold was. To release the gold, the arsenic was cooked at a really high temperature in a roaster, and that high temperature also converted the arsenic into a gas. So in the first few years of mining, that gas was released into the air. So by the 50s, people realized that this was not a good idea, and so they installed a system to stop the release of arsenic into the air. So the picture here shows an example of an electrostatic precipitator. So these things take the gas and it converts the arsenic into a dust. So a precipitator like this worked at Giant for about 50 years. So it did stop the arsenic from going into the air, but it did create the arsenic trioxide dust. So the dust is like a really fine powder. It's similar in consistency to a fine flour that you would have in your kitchen, except that it's 60% arsenic, and when you mix it with water, a lot of that arsenic will dissolve and it creates a really highly contaminated substance. So the dust is stored underground in purpose-built chambers and mined-out stopes. From the 50s to the 70s, all the storage areas were located in permafrost, but later it became apparent that the permafrost was degrading, and this process was likely accelerated due to the warm ventilation air that's pumped through the mine. So that's the basic problem. The project's trying to deal with this by freezing the ground around the dust so that the water can't make its way into the local Baker Creek or into Yellowknife Bay. So the next several slides are going to show where the dust is stored. So this first slide is just an overview of the giant mine site. So you can see the Ingram Trail running left to right here. This is a close-up of the center area of the mine. So again, the Ingram Trail is running left to right here. And so this shows the location of the arsenic chambers underground. So, of course, they're not on surface. They're stored about between 30 and 100 meters underground. So the arrow here shows where I'll be showing next on the next slide. The next view is going to imagine that we can go underground and look sideways at the chamber. So here we're imagining all the rock is gone, and so this shows 3 chambers that are colored in red. They're all filled with arsenic dust. These are all purpose-built chambers, so that's why they have smooth walls and nice rectangular shapes. The chamber 15 there on the left is empty. It was built but never used. So the arrow now is pointing at a mined-out stope called B208, and you'll see it's quite different than the chambers. This is again showing it underground, as if the rock has disappeared. So B208 is the pink area, and you can see all the tunnels around it as well. So it's the irregular shape of these stopes that make it so difficult to try to mine out the dust. You'd have to get it out of all the nooks and crannies and throughout the tunnels. And so, yeah, so to get it out, you'd have to send people down there to mine out an excavation that's 50 years old and filled with toxic dust, and it would be extremely dangerous. So here's a model of Stope B208, and to the left is the Precarian building. That's the one in town with the movie theater right beside it. So you can see just the size and magnitude of these storage areas. So at the bottom here, you can also see the tunnels that come out of the storage areas. All of these things are blocked and sealed with bulkheads. So the stability of these bulkheads are also a major concern. There's concern that they will fail one day and release arsenic into the mine. So currently water is pumped out of the mine. So any water that gets into the arsenic chambers will trickle down into the lower levels. It'll be collected and sent to a water treatment plant. So long-term, if nothing's done, the groundwater would fill the mine and thousands of kilograms of arsenic would be released into the water every year. Even sooner in the future, if nothing's done, the bulkheads or the crown pillars, the areas above the stopes could fail and also release arsenic into the mine. So that brings us to the frozen block method. So I'll briefly show how the method works and then summarize how it was chosen. This slide here shows two example arsenic storage areas. So the first step would be to drill new tunnels underground and install freeze pipes beneath the chambers. Next, more freeze pipes would be drilled and installed from the surface around each of them. The freeze pipes would be connected to a freeze plant, and the area around the chambers would be frozen. The next step adds water into each of the chambers and stopes. And the freezing process would continue until all the water is frozen. And finally, all the freeze pipes would be converted to thermosiphons, and that would be how it would stay frozen over the very long term. All right, so the frozen block method was selected through a process that took over 3 years. It involved many of Canada's leading technical experts, and over 40 public consultation sessions were completed. There were 3 multi-day public workshops held. And each step was reviewed by a completely separate group of experts known as the Independent Peer Review Panel. This slide shows a summary of the selection process. So it started with all methods, and it went through 3 complete rounds of assessment, getting feedback from the community at each stage. So that feedback led to the dropping of some options, modifications, and additions of some new ones. So the independent peer review panel took a complete look at everything at the end, and finally the frozen block method was selected. The slide here, maybe a little bit small, but it shows a complete listing of the 56 methods originally considered. So they're grouped into 4 categories. One, managing it in place, removing the dust, reprocessing it to recover the gold and or value of the arsenic, and finally ways to stabilize it and dispose of it. So following the first round, the 56 options were reduced down to 12 alternatives, and from these 12, 2 options were recommended, one for leaving it underground and one for taking it out. This slide here shows a risk ranking of all the 12 alternatives. So you can see here that the frozen block method had the lowest risk rankings in terms of the risk of an arsenic release and also for worker health and safety risks. All right, so the main reason why the frozen block method was selected that it mitigates the current risks without adding any new ones in terms of risk to the workers or to the environment. And it also keeps the dust safely contained over the long term. All right, so a full-scale freezing pilot study has been in place at the mine since 2011. So the objectives of the freeze optimization study, or the FOS, are basically to demonstrate that this method will work, and also to collect data that'll be used to support future engineering design decisions, and also to provide feedback into the ongoing project assessment. This slide here shows the location of Chamber 10, where the study is taking place. It can be seen right by the highway driving north of town. So the next few slides are just going to show some pictures of the construction of the FAWS. This one here shows the site preparation. So the first step was basically to excavate out all the contaminated soils at surface. Next, holes were drilled to put freeze pipes in. Here, this slide shows some workers installing the freeze pipes. Here are the thermosiphons being installed. So we're testing several types of ground freezing systems, some with active freeze pipes, some with thermosiphons, and some with a combination called hybrid thermosiphons, which Brent talked about yesterday or the day before. So this picture shows one of the freeze plants on site. So inside the container, the freeze plant looks like one that you would see at a local hockey rink, really. And finally, this shows some of the piping that connects the freeze pipes to the freeze plant. So some of the key results to date are that the ground is cooling faster than what was initially estimated. So that's a good thing. Both the active freezing and hybrid freezing systems are working well. And we've also been able to collect a good data set that's going to be used to help guide future engineering decisions. So this picture here shows what you would see if you went underground and looked at one of the chambers. The slide on the left was taken initially a month after the freeze systems were started up. And below on the right, you can see what the wall looks like after a few months of freezing. All right, so the next few slides are going to show some of the data. So I'll use this view, which is looking down over the chamber. The shape in the middle there is Chamber 10, which is filled with arsenic dust. The small black dots around the perimeter are the freeze pipes that are going into the page. And the ovals indicate the different freeze groups that are being evaluated. And the big blue spots are locations that we're monitoring temperature. So the blue zones here indicate, they show how much the ground is cooling. There's a scale on the lower right there, but basically the darker the blue, the colder the rock. So at first only the freeze pipes on the right side were started. So by April 2011, the ground on that side was getting frozen. But by December 2011, you can see that freezing was proceeding on all sides. So here are around the rock, whoops, sorry. Yeah, so around the freeze pipes, it was between minus 10, minus 15 degrees. By June 2012, most areas around the chamber were minus 10 degrees or below. And this is a more recent slide taken from the end of the winter of 2013. For the past year, the left side of the chamber has been operated using just passive thermosiphons only, so no energy being added. So results of the FAWS have been used to reassess the long-term performance of the frozen block and also look at some design improvements. This diagram here shows two chambers and what would happen to their frozen blocks under an extreme climate warming scenario. So here, even after 100 years, with thermosiphons running only, you can see that frozen conditions are able to be maintained around the chamber with all parts of the dust at minus 5 degrees or below. So we have a lot of other modeling results like this, which is showing that the frozen block will be able to maintain frozen conditions in the long term. So the study is also looking at other design improvements to the block design. So the next few slides will present some of the things that we're looking at and are currently evaluating. So this slide here shows cooling of the rock during the initial freezing. So the cooling power is greater further away from the ground surface as you get away from the summer heat flux going into the ground. So results like this are leading us to question if we really need to put in those horizontal freeze pipes beneath each of the chambers. This slide here shows two frozen blocks. The one on the left is a wet block, meaning that it's had water added to it. The one on the right was kept dry. And this shows them 20 years after somehow all the thermosiphons have stopped working. And you can see there's very little difference between the two pictures. And so results like these are leading us to question whether we really need to add water at all. And this is just a long list of things that are currently being tweaked as the design is continuing, looking at different things like pipe spacing and how deep they need to go beneath the chambers. So in summary, the arsenic trioxide dust has been a major source of concern for the local community for many years. And in its current state, it does represent a real risk. The frozen block method was selected through a long and careful process. It continues to be the best option available to us today. And while many details are still being evaluated, everything that we've learned so far has confirmed that the frozen block method will mitigate the existing risk and without creating any adverse effects to workers or the environment. Another advantages of it is that it's really easy to monitor these things. It's also adaptable. We'd be able to add additional thermosiphons as needed. And yeah, so it'll be safe over the long term. All right, so that concludes my presentation. Thank you.